Wait a minute. I will be honest. Terrible is a very strong word to describe my issues with this new video from Cody. However, I find that many people trust Alternate History Hub for genuine historical information, so I decided to use that word as it would ultimately attract more viewers. Call me dishonest, but unfortunately, that is the game of YouTube, after all. But my goal is not to get clicks for this shitty channel. Rather, it is to tell you about the flaws of this video that you, and Cody, should be aware of. Of course, we are not critiquing the actual alternative scenario, because Cody is right. There are countless possibilities for alternate history. Rather, we are going to analyze the information and conclusions that are used to create Cody's overall narrative. If you are a fan of Alternate History Hub, you now may be asking, who is this random asshole shitting on one of my favorite content creators? Well, I will tell you. Believe it or not, I've been a fan of Alternate History Hub since the release of his Godzilla video back in 2014, when he had about 12,000 subscribers, if I remember correctly.
Wrong.
I do not want to be a gatekeeper here, but I assure you that my experience with Alternate History Hub is over half a decade long, and I am doing this video more so as a service of love than a service of hatred. I like Cody's channel, but there are many cases where his lack of information or bias damage some genuinely interesting alternate history scenarios. And, in the case of this newest upload regarding China, at least one of these two factors are at play here. So, without further ado, let's get started.
Today, China becoming communist seems just like an inevitability, but really, it was one of the most least likely scenarios that could have happened. For decades, Mao and his Red Army were simply a fringe, but through guerrilla warfare, some poor decision-making by their enemies, and just dumb good luck, Mao eventually came up on top. What do you say? After the Nationalists launched a purge of thousands of communists, war had begun. The communists actually had it pretty bad for the first few years of the war. By 1934, they were on the brink of becoming just another footnote in China's long history. Surrounded by all sides by the Nationalists, in their desperation, they decided the best move was to retreat and reorganize. Break through the weakest opening and march 9,000 kilometers north through mountains and warlords to regroup at a better position. 90% didn't make it through the year-long trek, many dying from crossing a river which led to a change in leadership, but it was the maneuver that saved the Red Army and put Mao on track to becoming a national figure.
The victory of the Chinese Communists is actually much more likely than you think. If you have ever played Hearts of Iron 4, then you probably understand the sentiment. Communists actually made up a huge portion of the left-wing part of the Kuomintang Nationalist Party, and the Chinese Communist Party even publicly supported it. To say that the Communists were a fringe group for decades is actually quite inaccurate, as they were very integrated with Nationalist China for years, up until the late 1920s. They would again be together in the Second United Front, but we will talk about that later. When Sun Yat-sen, the first president of the Republic of China, died, Chiang Kai-shek took power. He was much like Augusto Pinochet of Chile, a right-wing authoritarian military dictator who attempted to purge all leftist elements from his party and government. He almost immediately betrayed the communists, killing thousands of them in the Purge of 12 April. Over the next year, tens of thousands of communists would be killed by the armies of Chiang Kai-shek and his allies. Despite all of this, the Communist Party of China still continued to support the Nationalist Party, that is, until all communists were forcefully exiled from it in 1927. As a result, the Communist Party of China quickly formed a Red Army in defense, and the Chinese Civil War began. The period between 1927 and 1936 was certainly when the Communists were most vulnerable, but they still held their ground against the Nationalists. After the devastating Long March, it seemed as if the Communists were ready for defeat in 1936. But, in that same year, the Nationalists ended hostilities against the Communists with the creation of the Second United Front against Japan. This allowed the Communists to gain some breathing space to properly re-establish themselves and assist the Nationalists against the Japanese invasion. Although they were small compared to the much larger Kuomintang forces, the Communists displayed tactical and strategic prowess that would become famous among military historians, and in works such as Mao Zedong's On Guerrilla Warfare. Since Japan fought primarily against the Nationalists exclusively on nationalist territory, the Kuomintang would be weakened much more than the Communists after the conflict. And here we enter the biggest piece of information that Cody missed from this part of the video, and that is the Soviet Union. The Soviets are directly responsible for allowing the Chinese Communists to become a major threat to nationalist China after World War II. Almost all the territory that the Soviet Union gained in its invasion of Manchuria was given to the Chinese Communists to assist their own efforts against the nationalists. The Soviets also supplied the Chinese with their own equipment and other munitions that were abandoned or captured from the Japanese army. Combine superior military strategy and tactics with major support from a global superpower, and you receive a basic formula for why the Communists ultimately won against the nationalists. Even if the Communists were close to defeat again, like before the Long March, they could have simply just retreated into Soviet-controlled territory or gained direct military support from the Soviet Union, like how China supported North Korea in the Korean War. Also, if the Communists were close to defeat even after the Long March, they could have simply retreated into Soviet-allied Mongolia and resettled in Soviet-controlled areas of Manchuria after the Second World War. So, overall, the idea that the communist victory in China was nearly impossible is inaccurate, and I would even go as far as to say dishonest.
The Nationalists in our timeline handled the Japanese invasion, poorly. Granted, it took the industrial might of the United States to ultimately destroy Japan's industrial capabilities, but
I will add a side note here as well. I briefly touched upon the Soviet invasion of Manchuria during the last point, but I should emphasize the important role that the USSR played against the Japanese as well. After all, the United States barely had anything to do with mainland China during World War II, so I believe that it is fair to mention the Soviets, who actually had a major impact on the Chinese front. In Manchuria, the Soviet Union easily crushed some of Japan's best land armies, which resulted in a faster territory change than anything seen from the United States during the entire Pacific Theater. The Soviet invasion may have even prompted Japan to begin the creation of terms of surrender. A masterful piece on foreignpolicy.com details how it was possible that the Soviets caused the Japanese to surrender, not the atomic bombs. This article is certainly a very interesting read, so I will leave a link to it in the description to see if you so wish, and not waste any more time talking about it here.
even then, for the Nationalists, the way they conducted themselves didn't paint them in the best light. Like abandoning Nanking, their own capital, doing nothing to stop the Japanese from, well, you know, or intentionally flooding one of the most populated regions to stop Japan's advancements, killing 400 to 500,000 of their own civilians in the process. Yeah, they weren't, perfect or competent. Even if the Nationalists did win against the Communists, they still probably would have done such buffoonish maneuvers during the war, which only hurts their own reputation to the general public.
Cody is right. The Kuomintang government was certainly destructive and incompetent. But just to further show how destructive and incompetent it was, I will show you a relevant video clip from a speech by political scientist and historian, Dr. Michael Parenti.
Henry Rosemont, he notes that when the communists liberated Shanghai from the U.S.-sponsored Kuomintang reactionary government in 1949, the communists found that about 20% of the population in Shanghai, 1.2 million people, were drug addicts. And every morning, special crews of street cleaners, quote, would gather up the corpses of children and adults who had been murdered during the night or died of disease, cold, and starvation.
The Nationalists, or Kuomintang, were not pro-democracy. In the beginning, under Sun Yat-sen's guidance, yes, the original Nationalists did wish for an American-style government, but these were early days. Hell, the Nationalists and Communists were even common allies against the imperial system. However, over time, and especially after Sun's death, the Nationalist goal became a united China, under one party, for at least a while, and we never actually saw the democracy part till Taiwan in the 80s.
I would say that this analysis is certainly valid. However, I would add my previous information regarding the transformation of the Nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, which led to this drastic turn towards more authoritarian and monolithic policies. As I also explained previously, these policy changes would eventually cause the entire civil war between the Nationalists and the Communists to break out in the first place. These are just a couple of important details that I thought would help better picture the situation here.
Even if China was not communist, the Korean War probably still would have happened. North Korea still would have invaded and the Soviets would have supplied them. The difference here, however, is that the war would be over very quickly. The only reason the war ended in a stalemate at all after 3 years was because the Chinese launched a full-scale invasion, pushing back the South. If China was to get involved at all, it'd be to aid the UN, Americans, and South Koreans to stop the North, and Kim Il-sung's reign would end just as soon as it began, Korea becoming fully united. Or maybe China taking a little bit.
Unfortunately, this is probably Alternate History Hub's biggest moment in the entire video. In the context of Cody's scenario, Korea would actually end up becoming fully united under the communist government. Now, why is this? Well, it comes down to a key fact that I am surprised to see overlooked in the creation of Cody's alternate scenario. You see, the military coalition led by the United States was approved by the United Nations Security Council, and any single member of the Security Council can veto any resolution. The Soviet Union was a permanent member of this council, and it directly supported North Korea. So why did the Soviets not veto the entire United States-backed counter-invasion? Well, it is because the USSR was boycotting the Security Council over its refusal to recognize Communist China as the proper Chinese government. I will let this article from History.com explain the rest.
In late June 1950, it became apparent that the Soviet action had backfired when the issue of North Korea's invasion of South Korea was brought before the Security Council. By June 27th, the Security Council voted to invoke military action by the United Nations for the first time in the organization's history. The Soviets could have blocked the action in the Security Council, since the United States, Soviet Union, China, Britain, and France each had absolute veto power, but no Russian delegate was present. In just a short time, a multinational UN force arrived in South Korea and the grueling 3-year Korean War was underway.
So, if China never became communist, then the Soviet Union would have never boycotted the United Nations Security Council. And, as a result, the Security Council would have never allowed the US and its allies to enter the war against North Korea. Ultimately, North Korea would have been able to win against the South and unite the peninsula. Overall, in Cody's alternate scenario, the Korean peninsula would be undivided and fully red. Now, we have reached the halfway point in analyzing this video. Normally, I would continue until the very end, but I realized that this response would be way too long for a single video. So, in the interest of a more frequent upload schedule, I am splitting this response up into 2 parts. Don't worry, the next half should be released by next week. Overall, I hope you all enjoyed this response so far. I can guarantee that shorter uploads are coming soon. And, if you are new to my content, then please consider supporting this channel however you wish. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you soon.